Chapter 7. In the cider house by the light switch, there was a piece of paper pinned to the wall. It was some kind of list. The bottom quarter of the page had been torn away. Homer wanted to throw the paper away but noticed the top line, which said, "Cider house rules what rules?" He wondered, reading down the page. The rules were numbered. Please don't operate the grinder or the press if you've been drinking. Please don't smoke in bed or use candles. Please don't go up on the roof if you've been drinking, especially at night. Please wash out the pressed cloths the same day or night they are used. Please remove the rotary screen immediately after you've finished pressing. Please don't take bottles with you when you go up on the roof. Please, even if you are very hot or if you've been drinking, don't go into the cold storage room to sleep. Please give your shopping list to the crew boss by 7 o'clock in the morning. There should be no more than half a dozen people on the roof at any one time. If there were a few more rules, Homer couldn't read them because the page had been ripped off. Homer handed the torn paper to Big Taft. "What's all this about the roof?" he asked Deborah Pettigrew. "You can see the ocean from the roof," Deborah said. "That isn't it," said Big Taft. "At night you can see the carnival lights in Cape Kenneth." "That's no big deal," said Homer Wells. "It's no big deal to me, either," Big Taft said, "but those black workers really like it. They sit up on the roof all night, some nights," Deborah Pettigrew said. "They get drunk up there and fall off, some nights," Florence Hyde announced from the bedroom wing. "They break bottles up there and cut themselves all up," said Irene Titcomb. "Well, not every night, they don't," said Big Taft. "And one night one of them got so drunk and sweaty, running the press, that he slept in the cold storage and woke up with pneumonia," Deborah Pettigrew said. "You don't exactly wake up with pneumonia," said Homer Wells. "It's more complicated than that." "Excuse me," Deborah said. "Anyway, nobody pays attention to the rules," Big Taft said. "Every year Olive writes them, and every year nobody pays attention." Suddenly Wally arrived in the green van. He pumped the horn. Homer ran outside to see what he wanted. "Get in!" Wally shouted. "We've got to rescue my stupid father, he's in trouble at Sanborn's." For Homer Wells, who'd grown up in a world without fathers, it was a shock to hear that anyone who had a father would call his father stupid, even if it was true. Homer held the apples in his lap as Wally drove down Drinkwater Road to Sanborn's general store. The shop owners, Mildred and Bert Sanborn, were Senior's oldest friends. He'd been a schoolboy with both of them and had once dated Millie before he'd met Olive, and before Millie had married Bert. Warren Titus, the plumber, was standing on the porch of the general store, not letting anyone inside, when Wally and Homer drove into Hart's Rock. "It's good that you're here, Wally," Warren said, when the boys ran up to the porch. "Your dad got crazy." In the store, Homer and Wally saw that Mildred and Bert Sanborn had cornered Senior in a niche of shelves reserved for baking goods. Senior had littered the floor and much of himself with all the flour and sugar within his reach. "What's the trouble, Pop?" Wally asked his father. Mildred Sanborn gave a sigh of relief to see Wally, but Bert wouldn't take his eyes off Senior. "Trouble, Pop," Senior said. "He got in a rage when he couldn't find the dog food," Bert said to Wally, without looking away from Senior. "What did you want to do with dog food, Pop?" Wally asked his father. "Dog food, Pop," Senior repeated. "He doesn't remember, Wally," Bert Sanborn said. "We told him that he didn't have a dog," Mildred said. "I have to feed Blinky," Senior said. "Blinky was his dog when he was a boy," Millie Sanborn told Wally. "If Blinky was still alive, Senior," Bert Sanborn said, "he'd be older than we are." "Older than we are," Senior said. "Let's go home, Pop," Wally said. "Home, Pop," Senior said, but he let Homer and Wally lead him to their van. "I tell you, Wally, it's not alcohol," said Warren Titus, who opened the door of the van for them. "It's not on his breath, not this time." "It's something else, Wally," Bert Sanborn said. "Who are you?" Senior asked Homer. "I'm Homer Wells, Mr. Worthington," Homer said. "Mr. Worthington," Senior said. When they'd driven for almost 5 minutes, in silence, Senior shouted, "Everyone just shut up." When they got to Ocean View, Olive met the van in the driveway. She ignored Senior and spoke to Wally. "I don't know what he's had this morning, unless it's vodka. It wasn't on his breath when he left." "I think it's something else, Mom," Wally said. With Homer's help, he led Senior to the bedroom, got his shoes off, and asked him to lie down on the bed. Downstairs, Homer Wells told Olive and Wally that he thought it was something neurological. "Neurological?" Olive said. "What does that mean?" Wally said. Homer Wells, who had a habit of repeating the endings of sentences, knew that Senior's repetitions were insane. That habit was the first symptom he described in his letter about Senior Worthington to Dr. Larch. "He repeats everything," he wrote to Dr. Larch. Homer also noted that Senior forgot the names of the most common things. Dr. Larch's letter to Homer Wells was so impressive that Homer immediately showed it to Mrs. Worthington. "What you have described to me, Homer, sounds like some kind of evolving organic brain syndrome," Dr. Larch wrote. "In a man of this age, there aren't a lot of diagnoses to choose from. I suppose the man has Alzheimer's personal dementia. It's very rare. I looked it up in one of my volumes of the New England Journal of Medicine. Please tell Mrs. Worthington that a neurologist should examine her husband. I know there is at least one in Maine. It's only my guess that it's Alzheimer's disease," added Dr. Larch. "Alzheimer's disease?" asked Olive Worthington. "You mean it's a disease? What's wrong with him?" Wally asked Homer. Wally cried in the car on the way to the neurologist. "I'm sorry, Pop," he said. But Senior seemed delighted. When the neurologist confirmed Dr. Larch's diagnosis, Senior Worthington was excited. "I have a disease," he yelled proudly, even happily. It was almost as if someone had announced that he was cured. What he had was quite incurable. What a relief it was to him to learn that he wasn't simply a drunk. It was such an enormous relief to Olive that she wept on Wally's shoulder. She hugged and kissed Homer with an energy that Homer had not known since he left the arms of Nurse Angela and Nurse Edna. Mrs. Worthington thanked Homer over and over again. It meant a lot to Olive, although she had long ago fallen out of love with Senior, if she had ever truly loved him, to know that this new information permitted her to renew her respect for Senior. She was very grateful to Homer and to Dr. Larch for restoring Senior's self-esteem, and for restoring some of her esteem for Senior, too. All this contributed to the special atmosphere that surrounded Senior's death at the end of the summer, shortly before the harvest. A sense of relief was far more prevalent than was a sense of grief. Of course, the residents of Hart's Rock and Hart's Haven had some difficulty with the term. Alzheimer was not a name familiar to the coast of Maine in 194. The workers at Ocean View had particular trouble with it. Ray Kendall, one day, made it easier for everyone to understand. "Senior got Alzheimer disease," he announced. Alzheimer. Now there was a disease that anyone could understand. Just before the harvest, when Olive Worthington had typed her clean page of rules, almost exactly the same rules from the previous years, and had pinned them next to the light switch by the kitchen door, she offered Homer to stay. "I always hate it when Wally goes back to college," Olive told Homer. "And this year, without Senior, I'm going to hate it more. I would like it very much if you could be happy here, Homer. You could stay in Wally's room. I like having someone in the house at night, and someone to talk to in the morning." "I'm not sure how Dr. Larch would feel about it," Homer said. "Dr. Larch would like you to go to college one day, Olive said. And so would I. I know that Dr. Larch wants you to take all the sciences. Homer understood that she was recalling this from a letter from Dr. Larch. And Latin, said Olive Worthington. Latin, said Homer Wells. This was surely Dr. Larch's work. Dr. Larch wants me to be a doctor, Homer said to Mrs. Worthington. But I don't want to be. I think that he wants you to have the option of becoming a doctor, if you change your mind, Olive said. I think that he said Latin or Greek. So they often write to each other, thought Homer Wells, but all he said was, I really like working on the farm. Well, I certainly want you to keep working here, Olive told him. I need your help, through the harvest, especially. He wrote to Dr. Larch, requesting Larch's permission to stay at Ocean View. I'll take biology, Homer Wells wrote, and anything scientific. But do I have to take Latin? Nobody even speaks it anymore. Don't take Latin or Greek if you don't want to, Dr. Larch wrote to Homer Wells. It's a free country, isn't it? Homer Wells was beginning to wonder. In the same envelope with Dr. Larch's letter, there was a letter, which Dr. Larch had forwarded to him from good old Snowy Meadows. In Wilbur Larch's opinion, Snowy was a fool, but a persistent one. Hi, Homer, it's me, Snowy, Snowy Meadows began. He explained that his name was now Robert Marsh, of the Bangor Marshes. We're the big furniture family, Snowy wrote. The furniture family? Thought Homer Wells. Snowy went on and on about how he'd met and married the girl of his dreams, and how he'd chosen the furniture business, and how happy he was that he'd gotten out of street clouds. Snowy added that he hoped Homer had gotten out, too. And what do you hear from Fuzzy Stone? Snowy Meadows wanted to know. Old Larch says Fuzzy is doing well. I'd like to write a letter to Fuzzy, if you know his address. Fuzzy Stone's address, thought Homer Wells. And what did old Larch mean that Fuzzy is doing well? Doing well at what? Wondered Homer Wells, but he wrote to Snowy Meadows that Fuzzy was, indeed, doing well, that he had lost Fuzzy's address, and that he found that apple farming was healthy and satisfying work. Homer added that he had no immediate plans to visit Bangor. He would surely look up the furniture Marshes if he was ever in town. And, no, he concluded, he didn't agree with Snowy that a kind of reunion in street clouds was such a good idea. He said he was sure that Dr. Larch would never approve of such a plan. He confessed that he really missed Nurse Angela and Nurse Edna, and of course Dr. Larch himself, but wasn't the place supposed to be left behind? Homer Wells asked Snowy Meadows. Then Homer wrote to Dr. Larch. What's this about Fuzzy Stone doing well? Doing well at what? I know that Snowy Meadows is an idiot, but if you're going to tell him something about Fuzzy Stone, don't you think you should tell me, too? In time, thought Wilbur Large. He was stressed. Dr. Gingrich and Mrs. Goodall had prevailed upon the Board of Trustees. The board had requested Large's follow-up report on the status of each orphan's success or failure in each foster home. If this added paperwork was too tiresome for Dr. Large, the board recommended that Large should accept an administrative assistant. Large rested in the dispensary. He sniffed a little ether and composed himself. Gingrich and Goodall, he said to himself. Jingall and Goodrich, he muttered. Richall and Jinggood. Gooding and Hallrich. He woke himself, giggling. Why are you so merry? Nurse Angela said sharply to him from the hall outside the dispensary. Good balls and ding dong. Wilbur Large said to her. He went to Nurse Angela's office. He had plans for Fuzzy Stone. He called Bowdoin College where Fuzzy Stone would successfully complete his undergraduate studies and Harvard Medical School where Large intended Fuzzy to do very, very well. He told the registrar's office at Bowdoin that a sum of money had been donated to the orphanage at Street Clouds for the purpose of paying the medical school expenses of an exceptional young man or woman who would be willing to serve Street Clouds. Could Dr. Larch have access to the transcripts of Bowdoin's recent graduates who had gone on to medical school? He told a slightly different story to Harvard Medical School. He wanted access to transcripts, of course, but in this case, the sum of money had been donated to establish a training fellowship in obstetrics. It was the first traveling Wilbur Large had done since he'd chased after Clara. The first time he'd slept in a place other than the dispensary since World War I, but he needed to familiarize himself with the transcript forms at Bowdoin and at Harvard Medical School. Only in this way could he create a transcript for F. Stone. He asked for a typewriter and some paper. One of your blank transcript forms will make it easier for me, and pretended to type out the names and qualifications of a few interesting candidates. I see so many who'd be perfect, he told them at Bowdoin and Harvard, but it's impossible to know if any of them could tolerate St. Cloud's. We're very isolated, he confessed, thanking them for their help, handing them back their transcripts. Fuzzy's transcript was already in the proper place. When he had returned to Street Clouds, Dr. Larch wrote to Bowdoin and Harvard, requesting copies of the transcripts of a few outstanding graduates. He had narrowed the choices down to these few, he told them. A copy of Fuzzy's transcript came in the mail with the others. When Larch had visited Harvard Medical School, he'd taken a Cambridge post office box in Fuzzy's name. Now he wrote to the postmaster there, requesting to forward the mail for F. Stone to Street Clouds. The P.O. Box address would be useful, too, if young Dr. Stone had to go on mission abroad. Then he sent an empty envelope to the Cambridge address and waited for its return. When the letter came back to him, when he was sure that the system worked, he composed the rest of the history regarding F. Stone and his adoptive family named Eames and sent it along to the Board of Trustees, together with Fuzzy's address. He did not have to invent anything regarding Snowy Meadows and most of the others, although he had difficulty typing the furniture marshes without laughing out loud, and when he came to the case of Homer Wells, he thought very carefully about how to describe the problem with Homer's heart. Among the members of the board, there wasn't a heart specialist or even a surgeon. There was a very old GP who, Dr. Larch felt sure, never read anything at all. Larch didn't count Dr. Gingrich as a doctor, he counted psychiatrists as nothing at all, and he felt confident that he could confuse Mrs. Goodall by the slightest terminology. He confessed to the board, isn't everyone flattered by a confidence? That he had not said about Homer's heart to Homer as he was afraid that worrying the boy could contribute to his problem, and he wanted the boy to gain confidence in the outside world, yet he intended to tell Homer about it, shortly. Larch said he had informed the Worthingtons of the heart defect. He concluded that he thought the board's request for the follow-up reports had been a good idea and that he had enjoyed himself a lot in preparing them, so he didn't need an administrative assistant to perform such a service. It was Wally's last night home. He was going back to college in the morning. "You'll look after Candy for me, won't you, Homer?" Wally asked Homer. Candy was going to finish her senior year at the Girls' Academy in Camden. She came home most weekends, but Wally stayed in Orono except for Thanksgiving and Christmas and the longer vacations. "Right," said Homer Wells. He was eager for the harvest to start. He was curious about meeting the migrants, about seeing the Negroes. He didn't know why. Were they like orphans? Because he loved Wally, he decided to keep his mind off Candy. It was a bold decision. And this evening there was a plan. Homer Wells liked every evening to have a plan, even if he was not very excited about this one. He drove Wally, in Senior's Cadillac, to Kendall's Lobster Pound, where Candy was waiting. He left Candy and Wally there. Candy and Wally wanted a private goodbye together before Ray came home. In the morning, Wally left for the university in Orono. The next day, Candy left for Camden Academy. The day before the picking crew arrived at Ocean View, Homer Wells, the tallest and oldest boy at Cape Kenneth High School, attended the first class meeting of senior biology. His friend Deborah Pettigrew had to lead him to the laboratory. The textbook for senior biology was B. A. Bensley's Practical Anatomy of the Rabbit, The book filled Homer Wells with longing. It was a shock for him to realize how much he missed Dr. Larch's old copy of Gray's. Homer, at first glance, was critical of Bensley, whereas Gray's began with the skeleton, Bensley began with the tissues. But the teacher of the class, Mr. Hood, pleased Homer Wells when he said that he, like Gray's, would begin with the bones. Homer looked at the ancient yellow skeleton of a rabbit. The class was hushed. Wait till they get to the urogenital system, thought Homer Wells, but this thought shocked him, too. He realized he was looking forward to getting to the poor rabbit's urogenital system. He had a view of the rabbit's skull, he tested himself with the naming of parts, it was so easy for him. How well he remembered Clara and the others who had taught him so much. As for Clara, she was finally buried in the cemetery in Street Clouds. It was the first burial when Wilbur Larch had wept. Mrs. Grogan knew that his tears were not for Clara. Larch decided to bury Clara because he thought that Homer Wells would never come back. "Well, he's wrong," Nurse Angela said. "Even a saint can make a mistake. Homer Wells will be back. He belongs here." Dr. Larch had anticipated the letter that arrived for F. Stone, forwarded from Fuzzy's P.O. box address. "Is this a joke?" Nurse Angela asked, turning the envelope around and around. "I'll take that, please," Dr. Larch said. It was from the Board of Trustees, as he had expected. That was why they had wanted those follow-up reports from him and why they had requested the addresses of the orphans. They were checking him, Larch knew. The letter to Fuzzy began with good wishes. It said that the board knew a lot about Fuzzy from Dr. Larch, but they wished to know anything further about Fuzzy Street Clouds experience, anything, naturally, that he wanted to share with them. The Street Clouds experience sounded to Wilbur Larch like a mystical phenomenon. The attached questionnaire made him furious. The questions were really stupid, but he took the business very seriously. He wanted Fuzzy Stone's answers to the questionnaire to be perfect. He wanted to be sure that the Board of Trustees would never forget Fuzzy Stone. There were 5 questions. Was your life at Street Clouds properly supervised? Have you ever felt that your treatment was especially affectionate or abusive? Did you receive adequate medical attention at Street Clouds? Were you adequately prepared for your new life in a foster home, and do you feel your foster home was carefully and correctly chosen? Would you suggest any possible improvements in the methods and management of Street Clouds? Do you think that a more youthful, energetic staff could improve the situation? Was any attempt made to integrate the daily life of the orphanage with the life of the surrounding community? What community? screamed Wilbur Larch. "We're on this earth to be of use," Wilbur Larch as Fuzzy Stone wrote to the Board of Trustees. "It is better to do than to criticize," wrote that young idealist, Fuzzy Stone. "It is better to do anything than to stand by idly. You tell them, Fuzzy," thought Dr. Larch. And so Fuzzy Stone told the Board of Trustees that the hospital at Street Clouds was a model of the form. "Dr. Larch made me want to be a doctor," Fuzzy wrote. "That old guy, Larch, he's an inspiration. You talk about energy, the guy is as full of energy like a teenager. You talk about affectionate, that's about our nurses. They're always hugging and kissing you, but they know how to shake some sense into you, too. You talk about supervised," Fuzzy Stone wrote. "Nurse Edna and Nurse Angela don't miss a thing." And some of the girls used to say that Mrs. Grogan knew what they did before they did it, before they even knew they were going to do it. "And you talk about community," wrote Fuzzy Stone. "Street Clouds was something special. I just remember the people, coming and going, they came to look at us, as if we were one of the marvels of Maine." Larch rested in the dispensary. Nurse Edna looked in once. Wilbur Larch was one of the marvels of Maine to her, and she was worried about him. Larch was a little worried himself, when he woke. "The problem is that I have to last," he thought. He could rewrite history, but he couldn't touch time. Even if he could convince Homer Wells to go to a real medical school, it would take time. It would take a few years for Fuzzy Stone to complete his training. "I have to last until Fuzzy is qualified to replace me," thought Wilbur Larch. When Homer Wells read the questionnaire, which was sent him by the Street Clouds Board of Trustees, he did not know why he felt anxious. Of course, Dr. Larch and the others were getting older, but they were always older to him. He asked himself what might happen to Street Clouds when Dr. Larch was too old. But this thought was so troubling that he tucked the questionnaire into his copy of Practical Anatomy of the Rabbit. Besides, it was the day the migrants arrived, it was harvest time at Ocean View, and Homer Wells was busy. He and Mrs. Worthington met the picking crew at the Apple Mart, and led them to the cider house. More than half the crew had picked at Ocean View before and knew the way. The crew boss looked very young to Homer. His name was Arthur Rose, and he looked about Wally's age. He had been the crew boss for 5 or 6 years. Arthur Rose had done a good job. He brought the right number of pickers, and very few of them ran off, or lost more than a day or two of good work because of too much drinking. And when there was an occasional child among them, the child behaved well. There were always pickers who fell off ladders, but there had been no serious injuries. There were sometimes small accidents around the cider press, but that was during late night work, when the men were tired or drinking a little. And drinking led to the rare accidents when some of the pickers fell off the cider house roof. Olive Worthington never called the crew boss Arthur, no one else called him Arthur, either. For reasons that were never explained to Homer Wells, he was Mr. Rose to everybody. When Olive introduced him to Homer Wells, her respect for the crew boss was clear. "Homer," Olive said, "this is Mr. Rose." "And this is Homer Wells," Olive added. "Glad to know you, Homer," said Mr. Rose. "Homer has become my good right hand," Olive said affectionately. "Glad to hear that, Homer," said Mr. Rose. He shook Homer's hand strongly. He was no better dressed than the rest of the picking crew, but he wore a real silk necktie for a belt. His shoes were good, and good shoes were vital for farm work. They were old, but well oiled, comfortable looking and in good condition. His suit jacket had a watch pocket, and in it, there was a gold watch that worked. He was very clean shaven, his face was like a smooth brick of the darkest, bitter chocolate. Mr. Rose spoke and moved slowly and modestly. Yet he looked extraordinarily sure of himself. It was a hot, Indian summer day. Mr. Rose and Mrs. Worthington stood talking among the parked farm vehicles in the Apple Mart lot, the rest of the picking crew waited in their cars. There were 17 pickers and a cook, no women nor children this year, to Olive's relief. "Very nice," Mr. Rose said when he saw the flowers in the cider house. Mrs. Worthington touched the rules she had tacked to the wall by the kitchen light switch. "And you'll show these to everyone, won't you, please?" Olive asked. "Oh yes, I'm good at rules," said Mr. Rose, smiling. "Come back and watch the first press, Homer," Mr. Rose said, as Homer held open the van door for Olive. "You can watch us make a little cider. About 1,000 gallons one," he added shyly. "All we need is 8 hours, and about 300 bushels too of apples," said Mr. Rose. 1,000 gallons, he repeated proudly. On the way back to the Apple Mart, Olive Worthington said to Homer, "Mr. Rose is a real worker. If the rest of them were like him, they could improve themselves." Mr. Rose was the fastest picker in the crew, and he never dropped fruit. He never bruised the apples by bumping his canvas picking bucket against the ladder. "A little slower, George," he said. "If you bruise that fruit, what can you do with it?" "It can be used just for cider," George answered. "That's right," Mr. Rose said. "Cider apples are only a nickel a bushel." "Okay," George said. In the evening, Homer watched the glow of the cigarettes above the roof of the cider house. When he got cold, he went to watch them pressing and to have a little cider and rum. Mr. Rose was glad to see him. He gave Homer a drink with very little cider in it, and together they watched the orchestra of the pump and grinder. A man named Jack, who had a terrible scar across his throat, aimed the spout. A man named Orange slapped the racks in place. His name was Orange because he had tried to dye his hair once, and it turned out orange, but there was no evidence of that color on him now. The rum had made Jack and Orange both savage about their business, yet Homer felt that Mr. Rose, who seemed sober, was still in control. He was the conductor of both the men and the machinery. "Let's try to finish the work by midnight," Mr. Rose said calmly. In the other corner of the room, two men were bottling the cider. One of the men began to laugh, and his partner started to laugh with him so loudly that Mr. Rose called out to them, "What's so funny?" One of the men explained that his cigarette had fallen out of his mouth, into the vat. At this announcement, even Jack and Orange began to laugh, and Homer Wells smiled, but Mr. Rose said quietly, "Then you'll have to fish it out. Nobody wants that bad cider." The men were quiet, now, just the machinery went on with its screaming. "Go on," Mr. Rose repeated. The man with the lost cigarette stared into the 1,000-gallon vat. It was only half full, but it was still a swimming pool. He took off his rubber boots, but Mr. Rose said, "Not just the boots. Take off all your clothes, and then go to take a shower, and be quick about it. We have got work to do." "What?" the man said. "I am not going to strip and wash just to go swimming in there." "You're filthy all over," said Mr. Rose. "Be quick about it." "Hey, you can be quick about it," the man said to Mr. Rose. "If you want that butt out of there, you can fish it out yourself." Then Orange spoke to the man. "What business are you in?" Orange asked him. "Hey, what?" the man asked. "What business are you in, man?" Orange asked. "Say that you are in the apple business, man," Jack advised the man. "Say what?" the man asked. "Just say that you are in the apple business, man," Orange said. At that moment, Mr. Rose took Homer's arm and said to him, "Go and see the view from the roof, my friend." Mr. Rose very gracefully led Homer out of the room. "Do you know what business Mr. Rose is in, man?" Homer heard Orange asking. "He is in the knife business, man," he heard Jack say. "Don't go in the knife business with Mr. Rose," Homer heard Orange say. "Just stay in the apple business, man," Jack said. Homer was following Mr. Rose up the ladder to the roof when he heard the shower turn on. Except for their cigarettes, the men on the roof were hard to see, but Homer held Mr. Rose's hand and followed him until they found two good seats. "You all know Homer," Mr. Rose said to the men on the roof. They greeted Homer. The man called Hero was up there, and the man called Branches, there was someone named Willie, and 2 or 3 people whom Homer didn't know, and the old cook whose name was Black Pan. Someone handed Homer a bottle of beer, but the bottle was warm and full of rum. "It's stopped again," Branches said, and everyone stared toward the sea. The nightlife lights of Cape Kenneth were low along the horizon, but the high Ferris wheel blazed brightly. It was holding still, loading new riders, letting off the old. "Maybe it stopped to breathe," Branches said, and everyone laughed at that. Then the Ferris wheel started again. "There it goes again," Hero said. "It's like a star," Black Pan, the old cook, said. "It looks cool, but if you get too close, it burns you. It's hotter than a flame." "It's a Ferris wheel," said Homer Wells. "It a what?" Willie said. "A what wheel?" Branches asked. "A Ferris wheel," said Homer Wells. "That's the Cape Kenneth Carnival, and that's the Ferris wheel." Mr. Rose nudged him in the ribs, but Homer didn't understand. No one spoke for a long time, and when Homer looked at Mr. Rose softly shook his head. "I heard of something like that," Black Man said. "I think that they had one in Charleston." "It's stopped again," Hero observed. "It's letting off passengers, riders," said Homer Wells. "It's taking on new riders." "People ride that thing?" Branches asked. Mr. Rose said, mildly, "You're so uneducated, Homer's having a little fun with you." When the bottle of rum passed from man to man, Mr. Rose just passed it along. "Doesn't the name Homer mean anything to you?" Mr. Rose asked the men. "I think I heard of it," the cook Black Man said. Homer was the world's first storyteller, Mr. Rose announced. Then he nudged Homer in the ribs again and said, "Our Homer knows a good story, too." "What kind of wheel do you call it, Homer?" Branches asked. "A Ferris wheel," said Homer Wells. "Yeah," someone said. Everyone laughed. "A Ferris wheel," Hero said. "That's pretty good." One of the men whom Homer didn't know rolled off the roof. Everyone waited until he was on the ground before they called down to him. "Are you all right?" Black Pen asked. "Yeah," the man said, and everyone laughed. When Mr. Rose heard the shower start up again, he knew that his bottle man had found the cigarette and was washing the cider off himself. "Willie and Hero go to bottle the cider now," said Mr. Rose. "I bottled last time," Hero said. "Then you are really good at it," said Mr. Rose. Homer sensed that he should leave the roof with Mr. Rose. They helped each other with a ladder. On the ground, Mr. Rose spoke very seriously to Homer. "You have to understand," Mr. Rose whispered. "They don't want to know what that thing is. What good it do them to know?" "Okay," said Homer Wells and walked back through the orchards to the Worthington house. When he saw the light under her bedroom door, he said, quietly, "Good night, Mrs. Worthington." "I'm back." "Good night, Homer," she said. In the morning, Mr. Rose came up to Homer, who was working as a checker in the orchard. "I want you to show me that wheel," Mr. Rose said, smiling. "The Ferris wheel?" said Homer Wells. "If you don't mind showing me," said Mr. Rose. "But don't tell anyone about it." "Right," Homer said. "Then we should go soon, before it gets colder and they close it for the season. I'm sure that it's very cold to ride it now." "I don't know if I want to ride it until I see it," said Mr. Rose. "Sure," said Homer. Mrs. Worthington let him take the van. Mr. Rose was quiet all the way to Cape Kenneth. The summer crowd was gone, some of the carnival events were already closed up. "Don't be nervous," Homer said to Mr. Rose. "The Ferris wheel is perfectly safe." "I'm not nervous about the wheel," said Mr. Rose. "Can you see a lot of people of my color around here?" Homer had detected nothing hostile in the looks from the people. As an orphan, he always suspected that people stared at him. But now he noticed more of the looks. When they got to the Ferris wheel, there was no line of people. When the wheel stopped, Homer and Mr. Rose got on and sat together in one chair. "We could each sit in our own chairs, if you prefer," said Homer Wells. "No," said Mr. Rose. When the wheel began its rise, he was very still and straight and held his breath until they were nearly at the top. "Over there's the orchard," pointed Homer Wells, but Mr. Rose stared straight ahead. "What's so special about doing this?" asked Mr. Rose. "It's just for the ride, and the view, I guess," said Homer Wells. "I like the view from the roof," Mr. Rose said. When they started the descent of the wheel turn, Mr. Rose said, "It's good that I didn't eat much today." By the time they passed ground level and began their ascent again, a large crowd had formed, but they weren't standing in line for the next ride. When they were at the top of the wheel turn again, Homer realized that the crowd below them had formed to stare at Mr. Rose. "They have come to see if niggers fly," Mr. Rose said, "but I'm not going to entertain them. They have come to see if the machine is going to break down, trying to carry a nigger, or maybe they want to see me throw up." "Just don't do anything," Homer Wells said. "That's the advice I hear all my life, boy," Mr. Rose said. As they started their descent, Mr. Rose leaned out of the chair and vomited over the crowd below them. The crowd moved as one, but not everyone moved in time. When their chair was at the bottom of the descent again, the Ferris wheel was stopped so that the sick man could get off. The crowd had moved away, except for a young man who was especially splattered. As Homer Wells and Mr. Rose were leaving the Ferris wheel grounds, the young man came forward and said to Mr. Rose, "You look like you wanted to do that. Who wants to get sick?" said Mr. Rose. He kept walking, and Homer kept up with him. The young man was about Homer's age. "I think that you wanted to," the young man said to Mr. Rose, who stopped walking away then. "What business are you in?" Mr. Rose asked the boy. "What?" the young man asked, but Homer Wells stepped between them. "My friend is sick," Homer Wells said. "Please just leave him alone." "Your friend?" the boy said. "Ask me what business I'm in," Mr. Rose said to the boy. "What business are you in, mister?" the young man shouted at Mr. Rose. Homer saw that Mr. Rose was standing, very suddenly, chest to chest with a boy. The boy seemed surprised that he was standing so close to Mr. Rose, and so suddenly. He was a little taller, and quite a bit heavier, than Mr. Rose, yet he looked unsure of himself. "What business are you in, mister?" the boy repeated, and Mr. Rose smiled. "I'm in the throwing up business," Mr. Rose said in a humble manner. Someone in the crowd laughed. Homer Wells felt relieved. Mr. Rose smiled in such a way that allowed the boy to smile, too. "I'm sorry if any of it got on you," Mr. Rose said nicely. "No problem," said the young man, turning to leave. After taking a few steps, the boy turned in Mr. Rose's direction, but Mr. Rose had grasped Homer Wells by the arm and was already walking on. Homer saw shock on the boy's face. The young man's flannel jacket, which was still zipped shut, was flapping wide open. A single slash had slid it from the collar to the waist. Every button on the boy's shirt was gone. The boy gaped at himself, and then at Mr. Rose, who did not look back, and then the boy was pulled into the comfort of the crowd. "How did you do that?" Homer asked Mr. Rose, when they reached the van. "Your hands have to be fast," Mr. Rose said. Your knife has to be sharp. But you do it with your eyes. Your eyes keep their eyes off your hands. The wide-open jacket of the boy made Homer remember Clara and how a scalpel made no mistakes. Only a hand makes mistakes. His chest was cold, and he was driving too fast. When Homer turned off Drinkwater Road and drove through the orchards to the cider house, Mr. Rose said, "You see, I was right, wasn't I? What good is it, to apple pickers, to know about that wheel? Am I right?" Mr. Rose demanded. "Right," said Homer Wells,